Andrew Johnson was born on December 29th, 1808, in Raleigh, North Carolina, the third and last child of Jacob Johnson and Mary McDonough. One of his older siblings, a sister, had died in childhood. Both of Johnson's parents were illiterate, his father earning a stable living from his employment as a porter in North Carolina's State Bank, while his mother worked as a seamstress. Jacob Johnson's health took a turn for the worse when he helped rescue three men in a boat and strained himself, dying of what was likely a heart attack a short time after the incident, and leaving a 3-year-old Andrew fatherless. The death brought further strain on Johnson's mother, who put both Andrew and his brother in the apprenticeship program under the tutelage of tailor James Shelby. While Shelby taught Andrew the basics of tailoring, he left little impact in other fields, as another employee taught Andrew letters. After 5 years, Johnson and his brother ran away, and the reward was placed by Shelby. Johnson fled North Carolina and traveled to Lawrence, South Carolina, to avoid being apprehended. There he found work and met his first love, who rejected his marriage proposal. The basic framework of a slave was an individual who was unable to read and write, and thus their main and only utility was physical and manual labor. And because Johnson himself, as a young man, did not know how to read or write, he pretty much was identical to a slave in the sense that he had the same skill set that would be associated with an individual that was enslaved. And this is actually common courtesy with poor whites around that time period. The difference is that while that led to some empathy on the part of whites during that era, an individual like Johnson was unable to comprehend that, hey, wait a second, if blacks have the same disabilities as me based off of a circumstance of not being taught something as opposed to because of their race, maybe we deserve to be equal and have some similar rights. It's a really interesting parallel when you really think about it, that this man who stakes his career on being opposed to the advancement of this other ethnic group really shares a lot in common with his upbringing of what he knows, and the fact that most of his skill set is associated with things that are based around physicality. So he just never is able to figure out that this group is not in that much of a different scenario than myself. And I would dare to think that, okay, that's enough. Johnson returned to Raleigh to work out a buyout of his apprenticeship with Shelby, though this was unsuccessful, and Johnson relocated to the West to further avoid being apprehended for his earlier abandonment of Shelby. Johnson traveled mostly on foot from North Carolina to Tennessee, living briefly in Alabama before moving to Columbia, Tennessee. When Johnson traveled to Greenville, he was described as having fallen in love with the town at first sight and formed a tailoring business in front of his home. Johnson soon after married Eliza McCardle. Notably, the couple were married by Mordecai Lincoln, the first cousin of Thomas Lincoln, future U.S. President Abraham Lincoln's father. Eliza taught Johnson both mathematical and writing skills, though remained in Greenville for the most part throughout her husband's political career. The couple would have 5 children and remain married until Johnson's death. Johnson acquired his first slave in 1843, a 14-year-old named Dolly, later buying her half-brother Sam. Dolly would end up having 3 children who were much lighter in tone than her, leading to speculation that Johnson was their father. Sam was known as a proud man who negotiated the status of his work with Johnson, even receiving a tract of land and being said by Johnson's daughter to have owned the future president instead of the other way around. Johnson's slaves were freed in August 1863 during his tenure as Tennessee military governor. Johnson was elected town alderman in 1829, a few years later winning a bid for a floater seat and becoming a member of the 90th Regiment of the Tennessee Militia. There he gained the rank of colonel, and Johnson's first term in the legislature was amid a period of neither political party knowing their core values for certain. Johnson by this point revered Democratic President Andrew Jackson, who, like Johnson, was a Tennessean. Johnson was defeated in his 1837 re-election bid by the Whigs. By the 1840s, Johnson had served in both houses of the Tennessee state legislature. Johnson aimed to win a seat in the House of Representatives and succeeded with less than 1,000 more votes than his general election opponent. Johnson's positions included advocacy for the poor, being an anti-abolitionist, and support for limited spending on the part of the federal government. Johnson abandoned social functions in favor of spending time in the Library of Congress to study, and had a difficult relationship with President James Polk. Despite this, Johnson supported the Polk administration's entry into the Mexican War. Democrats nominated Landon Carter Hayes against Johnson in his bid for a fifth term, who attacked Johnson's Homestead Bill as a facilitator of abolition. Though Johnson supported Franklin Pierce's presidential bid, the latter did not carry Tennessee, the state legislature of which being acquired by the Whigs, and Johnson's congressional district having its boundaries redrawn to assure it as a safe pickup for the Whigs. Johnson lamented that he had no political future following his defeat. Next, Johnson's friends lobbied for him to run for governor. He was nominated unanimously by the Democratic Convention and defeated Whig Party nominee Gustavus Henry by over 2,000 votes. Some votes in favor of Johnson were cast in support of his promise to back Nathaniel Taylor in his bid for return to Congress, while Johnson found himself limited by the few powers of his new position, such as being incapable of vetoing legislation and having most appointments made by the Whig-controlled legislature. The office allowed him to publicize his views. Johnson emerged as a critic of the Tennessee common school system and supported an increase in funding through taxes, which was later passed. Overall, Johnson served 2 terms as governor before eyeing a bid for the U.S. Senate. During Johnson's era, the state legislature elected the United States Senator representing their state, which occurred in 1857. Johnson used his final address as governor to influence the elector's choice and was elected to the Senate by the group 2 days later. Johnson was elected due to being popular with small farmers and tradesmen, and while he was not well liked by lawyers and planters in the Democratic Party, neither group was as effective as Johnson in collecting votes. Johnson introduced his Homestead Bill again in the Senate, though it caught suspicion as being related to slavery since most of its supporters were Northerners. Johnson's efforts to convince his colleagues that the bill was not related to slavery fell on deaf ears, and a watered-down version of the bill later passed in both chambers, only to be vetoed by President James Buchanan. In October 1859, John Brown and his supporters raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, the incident increasing tensions between pro- and anti-slavery forces. Johnson delivered a Senate speech soon afterward, in which he argued that all men are created equal did not apply to black Americans, since the phrase was also in the Illinois Constitution, which barred voting by blacks. When Southern states began seceding from the Union, Johnson argued to future Confederate President Jefferson Davis that Democrats in the Senate could rebel against Lincoln's move to infringe on the South's interest. Tennessee's referendum to authorize secession failed, and the question was put up for a popular vote. During this period, Johnson campaigned on both questions despite threats to his life and actual assaults, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy in June 1861, after the passage of a second referendum. Johnson fled the state, leaving his family in Greenville, and became both the only Southern senator from a seceded state to remain in his position and the most famous Union Southerner. Johnson was a counsel to President Lincoln in the early months of the war due to this position, and spent congressional recesses in Kentucky and Ohio. Months after this, Johnson's tenure as a senator ended when he was appointed Tennessee military governor. Despite his absence from the Senate, the chamber passed the Homestead Bill, which has been credited with expanding settlement to the West. Johnson used his position as military governor to demand pledged loyalties from public officials and shut down newspapers under the ownership of Confederate sympathizers. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which declared freedom for slaves in Confederate states, did not include Tennessee at the request of Johnson. Johnson decided slavery had to end on the grounds that it could destroy the American government, and recruited 20,000 black soldiers to join the Union Army. Johnson was selected to be Lincoln's running mate in the 1864 presidential election, in spite of his previous running mate Hannibal Hamlin being in good health and not being opposed to running again. Johnson's selection instead came from Lincoln's wishes to depict a unified coalition in favor of preserving the Union, which was furthered by Lincoln's decision to run under the National Union Party ticket, as opposed to the Republican one that he had been on 4 years prior. The most significant thing to remember about the period of Johnson both being picked as vice president and then serving as vice president, it's very brief, it's only a couple of weeks, is that he was only ever selected for that position because Lincoln wanted to have a ticket that appeared unified, which by having someone from the South, albeit the one person from the South who stayed with the Union, this could be accomplished. And it becomes all the more tragic in realizing what happens afterward with the assassination. But not only for that reason, but also because, as I mentioned at other points in the documentary, we have a tendency as Americans to really emphasize the office of the presidency at the expense of completely ignoring uh, any other position, whether it be people who are vice presidents, members of the House, the Senate, and Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's vice president for his first term, is an unsung hero who, I mean, it's a literal case of what could have been, because the biggest folly of Johnson is that he doesn't continue what Lincoln is assumed to have wanted to do after, the Civil War ends. And due to the fact that Hamlin was this staunch opponent of slavery and left the Democratic Party to, make his statement and be on the side of the abolitionists that were fully for this. I think if he had been in office or had been retained for Lincoln's second term and we had the assassination play out and Hamlin became president, he would have probably been, if not in the top five, then at least the top 10 as this champion of equality and carrying through what Lincoln had intended. And it's so sad that this terrific man who actually believed in this equal right opportunity thing for blacks as he did for any other ethnic group, instead of being in a position to capitalize on that, has to sit back and watch for 4 years as the guy that got picked just to balance a ticket gets to live out and waste the opportunity that he would have fully used to benefit a lot of people. Johnson was unusual for a vice presidential candidate for his day, as he gave multiple speeches in various states. The Lincoln-Johnson ticket won the election, which included carrying Tennessee, despite the state's votes not being counted by Congress. At his inauguration, Johnson appeared drunk and was hastily sworn in by his immediate predecessor, Hamlin. Johnson's last meeting with Lincoln was on the afternoon of April 14, 1865. Lincoln that night being assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Fort Steeder. Johnson himself had been subject to an unsuccessful assassination attempt, though his would-be killer lost his nerve. Johnson requested each Lincoln cabinet member remain in their position and objected to a deal reached between Union General William Sherman and Confederate General Joseph Johnston for North Carolina Confederate forces surrendering in exchange for the state government remaining in power in the South. Johnson's placing of a bounty on the head of Confederate President Jefferson Davis caused the belief that he would be tough on the South. Johnson viewed an antagonistic relationship with radical Republicans in favor of abolition as being the key to his plans for Reconstruction being passed and a potential re-election in 1868. He wanted to be depicted as the naysayer to this group, losing an opportunity to do so when a bill to give blacks voting rights in the District of Columbia passed in the House but stalled in the Senate, and as a result prevented him from vetoing it. Moderate Republican leader Lyman Trumbull believed he could work with Johnson and ushered bills extending the Freedmen's Bureau beyond its scheduled abolition and the first Civil Rights Bill, both of which he believed Johnson would sign. Johnson appeared during his multiple meetings with Trumbull to be supportive of the measures, though this was something Johnson did during meetings, appearing to be in accordance with the position of whoever he was meeting. When Johnson vetoed the Freedmen Bureau's extension bill, he thought his victory would signal the defeat of the radical Republicans, and the moderate members of that same party would unite behind his agenda, apparently not realizing that they also wanted blacks to be treated fairly. Johnson delivered a speech on George Washington's birthday intended to honor the first president, but instead mentioned himself over 200 times in the span of an hour, and named Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, Senator Charles Sumner, and abolitionist Wendell Phillips as men still opposed to the Union that were plotting his assassination. Republicans saw the speech as Johnson's declaration of war, and the address was estimated to have lost around 200,000 votes for Democrats in the midterm elections held later that year. So the leading two radical Republicans in Congress in Johnson's tenure are the same ones that were there when Lincoln was in office. Thaddeus Stevens, the representative from Pennsylvania, and Senator Charles Sumter. And they lead the charge against slavery. They oppose him in all of his ways to diminish the progress that was made during Lincoln's tenure. And it's, if I may do a little bit of an editorial here, it really sucks that we live in such a modern lazy era where people are told to memorize the names of the presidents. People are told to do stupid papers on presidents they don't care about, that didn't do anything worth a damn anyway. And you have these two men, Sumter and Stevens, who, I mean, if I were going to name real life Superman from the 19th century, it would be those two, most likely. Um, I just don't understand how you can have people who say, we are not part of this group, but we have an empathy for this group, and thus we want them to have equal rights. And because they don't happen to become president or serve in the highest office in the land, they get completely ignored in favor of the, it reminds me of a thing someone said where they mentioned that people will always remember Hitler, um, and they'll, the ultimate evil, right? And always remember FDR, the ultimate good. But if you're a good that was not in the highest office, just some regular politician that was, on the morally right side of the issue, you get completely pushed to the side. And it bothers me more than probably anything that this era of Johnson's presidency, where he will be more remembered than the people who actually fought against the things that he was trying to do. Because Stevens is one of the great, in my opinion, one of the greatest representatives of all time. Just for what he did in this 4-year period. It's a shame he didn't live to see the end of it, but it's people really need to pay more attention to representatives, and especially ones that have actually done something to change the course of history. Here, Johnson vetoed the Civil Rights Bill, his veto being overturned weeks later by Congress in what became the first instance of a major bill having its veto overridden in American history. This marked the point where moderate Republicans lost any hope for working with Johnson. The Freedmen Bureaus Act was passed later that year a second time by both chambers and vetoed by Johnson again, though this time his veto was overridden. That year also saw the Congress propose the 14th Amendment to the states, which granted citizenship to former states in the aftermath of the Civil War. Johnson was embarrassed when Congress ceded the Tennessee proposal at delegation after Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment. The 1866 midterm election was used as the battleground between Republicans and Johnson and the Democrats. Johnson underwent the Swing Around the Circle, a speaking tour where he gave multiple speeches across the U.S. that were marked by making comparisons between himself and Christ and getting in arguments with hecklers. The second French intervention in Mexico was taking place at the time Johnson took office, and the latter was persuaded by Sword to pursue diplomacy as opposed to sending troops. Now that we've arrived at the presidency part of Johnson's life, I'm just going to tell you up front, Johnson's main accomplishment, the only thing that occurred while he was in office that is still in effect today, was the Alaska Purchase. And that actually, ironically enough, was not because of him. It was because of his Secretary of State, William Sword, who was a holdover from Lincoln's cabinet, who had negotiated with the Russian minister to have a treaty that they would sign in exchange for the U.S. purchasing Alaska. And this was ratified by Congress in saying it was a partisan era wouldn't even begin to summarize the disdain between Johnson and the radical Republicans. So it's the one thing that sticks. Everything else he does, with the exception of empowering Congress, pretty much flip-flops throughout history. But the one thing that sticks is the Alaska Purchase. The reforms passed during Johnson's tenure include the Southern Homestead Act and another law that established an 8-hour workday for laborers and mechanics working for the federal government, though this bill's effectiveness has been questioned given that wages were soon cut by 20%. The saga that would begin Johnson's impeachment centers around him wanting to replace Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who publicly disagreed with the president but did not want the latter to appoint his successor. Johnson decided to fire Stanton during the period Congress was not in session and demand his resignation, Stanton refusing to quit and Johnson suspending him afterward. The Senate proceeded to contend that Johnson had purposely violated the Tenure of Office Act. Johnson's relationship with General Ulysses Grant was also severed during this period, due to Grant not retaining the duties of Stanton's position despite Johnson's objections. And Johnson nominated a replacement for Stanton who refused to leave office. The House impeached President Johnson on February 24, 1868, by a vote of 128 to 47. The House additionally adopted 11 articles of impeachment, and the impeachment trial in the Senate began on March 5th and ended up lasting for 3 months. Johnson's counsel urged him not to make any public remarks about the trial nor appear during it, a request that he mostly followed save for 2 interviews. A factor in the reluctance to impeach Johnson was that he would be replaced by Ohio Senator Benjamin Wade, who was beyond the pale politically in much of the U.S. due to his support for issues like women's suffrage, and his tenure could mark a disruption to the ambitions of Ulysses Grant. The final vote total was 35 votes for guilty and 19 for not guilty, 1 vote short of what was needed to successfully remove Johnson from office. Johnson sought renomination at the 1868 Democratic National Convention, where his support faded away with each ballot due to it mostly coming from the South, and failed to secure renomination. Horatio Seymour was nominated instead of Johnson. The latter gave no mention of him until the month before the election, and still did not give an endorsement even then. In the interim, Johnson sent proposals to Congress to limit the presidency to a single 6-year term and make the president and Senate directly elected, though these proposals were ignored by Congress. Notably, the Senate eventually would be under direct election by the voters. Johnson refused to attend the inauguration of his successor, Ulysses Grant, and spent several weeks in Washington afterward. Johnson's time following the presidency is marked by tragedy, as his son killed himself in the months after he left the office, and he runs for office a few more times in Tennessee, including for the House, and is able to actually win a Senate seat again. Serves there for a few months, then dies abruptly, and as a result of his death, the only former living president passes away, and Grant becomes one of a couple of presidents throughout U.S. history to have been the only living president and one of multiple living presidents. Okay. Johnson's legacy is one of controversy. He's considered one of the worst presidents ever for failing to institute any major continuation of any of Lincoln's policies as it related to Reconstruction, due to his differing philosophy on slavery, and is also seen as one of the most racist presidents. There's actually a number of articles that have been written over the last several years comparing him to Trump, as a contemporary way of labeling the current occupant of the White House as being of the same racial viewpoints. And he actually has been argued as being significant for being the first impeached president. But a lot of other people that I've seen have actually tried to say that because of the fact that there's this big gap between his impeachment and Clinton's impeachment, basically modern impeachment is thought of more so with Clinton. So even if he were to take that and go, I was the first one to have this, it wouldn't work. It's also notable to mention the fact that one of Johnson's main detractions is the fact that he is not an effective legislator at all. The other President Johnson, LBJ, was considered one of the greatest senators of all time for his ability to get things passed, make deals, see his legislative agenda get passed throughout his attack on poverty, war on poverty. And in Johnson's case, so Andrew Johnson's case, it's literally, well, I've got this Congress that is not the same parties. Now, whether than trying to throw them a bone and do some things together that can give us both a piece of what we want, he says, I'm going to oppose what they want entirely, and the moderate members of their party are gonna come to my will. It doesn't happen, and so for the last 3 years of his tenure, it's just this antagonistic back and forth where he always ends up losing because he has no allies in Congress or not enough allies to actually see his stuff get passed. And it really leaves his tenure with almost absolutely no accomplishment whatsoever other than the Alaska Purchase, which, as I stated earlier, wasn't even because of him. It was by Sword. So if you would give that credit to anyone else, I would say to Sword as the wonderful Secretary of State that he was, serving under a relatively abysmal president. In fact, the only reason I knew who Johnson was prior to ever being requested to do a documentary, to ever recording anything relating to him, was I said, who was the president after Lincoln? I find that very curious because in the case of the other top tier U.S. presidents, Washington, Roosevelt, you instantly know if you're just to have the slightest recollection of politics and the history of the U.S., who their successor is. You know Adams, Truman. In the case of Johnson, it's literally just this guy who got picked to be VP that gets in office and literally causes a disaster for several years until we get someone else in Grant who is, you know, slightly better, but he is the beginning of a period of relatively lackluster presidents. That is his legacy, the start of bile that doesn't seem to get out of the way, arguably until Roosevelt, the first one.